Hello, everybody. Welcome to day 12 of the Level Up Symposium. My name is Andrew Scriver, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to Games, Performance, and Digital Placemaking, presented by the Associated Designers of Canada with support from Toaster Lab's Mixed Reality Performance Atelier. I am one of the co-curators of the symposium and a member of the ADC, and I am very excited to be your host for this event. I would like to first acknowledge, of course, that I am coming to you from Tiohtià:ke, which is the unceded land of the settler city of Montreal, which is and was, long before colonizers arrived, a place of conference, conflict, and creativity for many Indigenous peoples, including the Kanien'kehá:ka, the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, and the Abenaki peoples. I am honored and humbled to be able to be here to create and share with you all, and so I offer my thanks. In this spirit of gratitude, I would like to acknowledge the support of the Canada Council for the Arts, our primary funder of the symposium as a whole, as well as our other sponsors: IATSE, the University of British Columbia, Theatre Alberta, CITT Alberta Chapter, Concordia University, Ryerson University, York University, and of course, all of our individual donors. Thank you so very much. So for your information, all of our symposium events will be recorded and presented in a freely available archive on our website a few days after the event. So thank you again for joining us today. You're either watching this live stream either on the Level Up website, which is levelup.designers.ca, on HowlRound at howlround.com through our partners at Toaster Lab, or on the respective Facebook pages for the ADC or Toaster Lab. Regardless of your viewing platform, embedded on the same page of the video is the chat function in the top right-hand corner of your window. You can click on the little speech bubble, and questions will be asked at any time, or can be asked at any time, and will be read out to the presenters. This event can be enjoyed through auditory or visual access, or a combination of both. I will read aloud all of the questions which are asked through the chat, and this information will appear visually at the bottom of your screen. Visual access is also supported with captioning for myself and for all speakers in the archived version of the event. If you require technical assistance to support your access at any time, please email levelup@designers.ca for immediate service or to provide feedback following the events. If you enjoyed this session or will enjoy this session, please consider donating any amount to the Associated Designers of Canada to support our national arts service organization in achieving its goals of advocacy, mentorship, and industry promotion. Donation links are available on all viewing platforms on our website, the ADC's website, or on canadahelps.org, so please consider donating. Thank you for your patience with all of our announcements. It is now my honor to welcome the guest of this event. Milton Lim is an interdisciplinary artist based in Vancouver, Canada. His research-based practice entwines publicly available data, interactive digital media, and gameful performance to create speculative visions and candid articulations of social capital. This line of inquiry aims to reconsider our repertoires of knowledge, aggregation, and political intervention in the contemporary context of big data and algorithmic culture. He works with Hong Kong Exile, Theatre Conspiracy, Videocan, and the Cultch. Welcome, Milton.
Hi there. Thank you so much, Andrew. And thank you to the ADC team for having me here. Just want to do a quick audio check. Is my level okay?
You sound great.
Perfect. I also wanted to first say that unfortunately the captions in my OBS was making my computer lag quite a bit, so we won't be able to do that for today. My apologies, that's on my part. The testing went okay last night, but as some things go, it didn't work out in the morning. Captions will be available afterwards, though. Mm-hmm. Great.
Very live. Welcome. Yes, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Perfect. And we'll see Andrew in a little bit for some Q&A. So yes, my name is Milton Lim. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm an interdisciplinary artist based in Vancouver, British Columbia, which is the traditional, ancestral, unceded, and occupied territories of the Coast Salish peoples of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Today, I'll be talking about games, performance, and digital placemaking, using a few of my projects as a case study to look at how my work is utilizes and is informed by digital. So these projects, just for a quick survey approach, include culturecapital, which is the arts economy trading card game that I've been creating with my friend Patrick Blencarn, asses.masses, which is a solo video game performance for multiple players about donkeys, and a relatively new initiative featuring interconnected virtual venues that I'm currently building as part of the Cultch's digital storytelling team at the Cultch in Vancouver, BC. And we're using gather.town to connect different virtual venues for digital programming. And at the end of all that, I would love to end off with a few thoughts or provocations that I'd like to share before we open up to questions. That being said, if you have any questions at all, please add them to the chat, and I'll try to address them as we go along, because I can see what you're saying. Thank you for the reminder. So before we launch into things, I just want to give a little bit of context, because I think it's important to know where I'm coming from. I'm working mostly in the Anglophone side of the performing arts, and I do work across dance, theater, live art, installation, and digital media. I do have a background in theater performance and psychology. I trained at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, BC. And as Andrew mentioned, the three main things that my practice revolves around are digital media, games or interactive performance, interactive systems as performance, and then an ongoing inquiry into publicly available data, which I'll get into in a second. And just for fun, I'll say that I also watch a lot of anime and play lots of video games. And those things resonate heavily in my practice, which hopefully we'll get to in a little bit. Great. So I'd like to start this off with a statement. And that is specifically based on around the Culture Capital game that I've been creating. Much of it is around, I'm just grabbing it so you can see. This card game has been created with many, many interviews done with artists from across Canada. And I'll launch into it in a little bit. But for now, I'll say that the thing that we often hear, my friend Patrick and I often hear about, why is live performance important, or like what gives it value? The three main things that it comes back to very often are that it's about liveness, it's about gathering, and it's about telling stories. So my statement is that performance culture in our country is largely based on rigid frameworks for liveness that exist often in generalities. So individuals can certainly make work outside of these paradigms, but I would like to propose that as a sector, if we want to continue pushing our form, that we need to own up to these inconsistencies. So let's unpack liveness a little bit. What is often meant, I think, is somewhat of an intangible expression of ephemerality and oftentimes a risk of failure. So when someone says they want to see a work that's live, I think that's often what they mean. But that brings into question, at what points do we assess the liveness of something as the benchmark of whether or not it is performance? So, I think most of us would agree that live performance would include two performers speaking text that is written by someone who is alive or dead in a dialogue format. Sure, that's live performance in front of other people. Some would say, is a card game a live performance? Am I participating? Am I just watching it? Is a book a live performance? Reading a book? Is the liveness grounded in the spectatorship of it? And as a further question to that, what validates something as a piece of art in this country? Is it when people come out to it, when it gets awards, or when it gets funded? There are several different intersections of when these things could be possible. And I don't say this to bring up a definitive reason for why it is a certain way, but to hopefully broaden the scope of what we mean by a certain sense of liveness and value. The second thing, gathering. I think when we in the performing arts say gathering, I think that there's often a conversation about the act of coming together to see a performance in a theater. But that feels a little bit awkward, mostly because the spaces in which we can actually be social in the performing arts, writ large, would be the lobby space, which is maybe not the most, it's a very transitory space, and some people hang around, but a lot of people leave. And even within the works themselves, architecturally, in most theater performance spaces, the space is designed for isolation. It's meant for us to be sitting alone in the dark, sitting beside other people, but relatively not connected with them, because we're all watching a proscenium. So this act of gathering, I think, deserves to be unpacked a little bit as well. And then there's also telling stories, the third part. And so what is often meant, I think, by that is effectual experiences of narrative, often told through dialogue from actors playing characters within a specific time span of roughly 40 to 75 minutes. And I bring this up because I think it's especially narrow when it comes to the vast array of different kinds of storytelling that we can hear. But the more and more I hear performance creators saying, I want to tell stories, it's a reminder that what what kind of stories are we telling, and what are the affordances of things that can only be 40 to 75 minutes. And as someone who plays video games, I do find that these works, the video games, largely demand more from me as a participant, and they leave more room for me to fill in the gaps. Um, as a little anecdotal story, I'll say that when I was playing Fallout 4 several years ago, I start the game with a very nice haircut. And this is a very strange thing, I know, but I start the game with a nice haircut. Throughout the game, I get other haircuts so that my hair gets more shaggy. And then when I've achieved a certain part of the story that I feel validates me cleaning up, I will get a nice haircut again, or tie it up or something like that. Which is, of course, emergent storytelling. That's something that I have created based within the framework and the meta of the game itself. And it's not maybe something that the creators were scripting or wanting me to see, but that it is something that is integral for my experience of the game itself. So playing a lot of role-playing games, especially where I clock 60 plus hours in games in varied capacities, often on my own time, does make me question about what kind of narratives are available when I have 60 hours versus when I have maybe 1.5 hours. And even then, an audience is likely going to say I'm pushing it for an hour and a half performance. And we can see this really manifest in the kind of narrative shifts that we got out of serial television series, from the movement of 25 minutes to HBO hour-long programming, and what we could get both in character development, in what spectators or audiences would forget about, thinking about how Breaking Bad would often tease something at the beginning of an episode that we'll forget about, and then at the end, it'll come and be a really pivotal point of that episode. And that's just not something you can do in 25 minutes, because we often remember at the beginning of the episode, oh yes, that's true. That just happened. I didn't forget about it. So I bring up those things, liveness, gathering, and storytelling, to hopefully illustrate that theater does not have a monopoly on any of those things. And while I think that they are absolutely legitimate and important things to give value to live performance and theater more specifically, I think that we can be more specific and maybe a little bit more generous when we say why it's valuable. And to come full circle to this symposium, why digital? Honestly, not everything in my practice has to be digital. I did make a card game, after all. But I don't personally separate digital out from performance creation, because I see it as an extension of my relationship to the world, to my hobbies, my interests, and the ways in which my ideas manifest. So from social media to video games to on-demand movies, we already have deeply sophisticated vocabularies on conceptions of liveness, on gathering and storytelling on digital platforms. And yet, in the time of the pandemic especially, I've been quite surprised to see that we're quite bound to theatrical tradition. So going over to my examples then, if I could get the screen share going, Pat, thank you so much. So because I had most things running through OBS, my apologies. I very quickly put together all the web pages I needed, and I'll be using it this way. But this is delving into, first and foremost, a project that I started with my friend Patrick Blencarn in 2018, maybe at the end of 2017, like the day right before 2018 hit. This is Culturecapital. It's an online gameplay kind of esports tabletop card game. It can be played in a variety of different ways. So it could take the form of just a tabletop game where you play with friends. It could take the form of something that you watch. We have live tournaments that happen in festivals, and the two champions who rise from the round robin series, very similar to Yu-Gi-Oh, Pokemon, or Magic the Gathering tournaments. You would then be in the finals, and in the finals, you would face off against your opponent in a somewhat of a media showdown. And so I'm just going to go to the media setup here that you'll see is a flat screen TV placed on its side. And on the side of the TV, then I'm triggering everything through Isadora so that it's live responsive to the performers themselves. And they are playing for real money. And this is consistent across the different permutations on what kind of performance we are making. And most recently, we've also had an online version of the game, which has two players playing over Zoom, to which I bring it into OBS, usually when it's working, and then Isadora. and it's all put together very similar to any other kind of like D&D campaigns that you see online that you might watch in emergent storytelling. So I'll skip ahead to that video. Rather, I'll leave this running while I talk about, generally for context, how the game works is that players adopt the roles of stewards, they summon companies, and then they roll a die for government grants in order to realize the projects of different values. Then they use these projects to compete for community points. And then you can use strategic planning cards to change the tide of competition, and whoever has the most communities at the end wins. Now, importantly, this whole project is constructed from two important sets of data. The first one being federal, provincial, and municipal funding that we've aggregated within a given region of the performing arts companies in that area. And then, so that's real money that people have received, and knowing how they kind of compare to other groups. And then the other thing, which is hundreds of interviews with artists making performance in Canada. And out of those interviews, we make and construct as accurately as possible an illustration of how our arts economy functions. And of course, digital has to be part of this conversation. So importantly, we find that games are helpful in this case because of the rituals and rules they're associated with. They're much more flexible, or we're, as game creators, game players, we're often positioned to be problem solvers. And compared to a relatively passive spectator, games allow us to be much more active. And so participatory works are kind of necessarily built into the process as well. And so I'm gonna scroll down on some of these from our Instagram page, just like some of the different cards that you can see. So the form is not as locked in a lot of these games. And in considering it as a piece of performance, I would say many of the codes and rules of traditional performance, which includes duration, silence, linearity, participation, and variability, are put into question. And that's very much an ongoing conversation that I'm having with my friend Patrick Blancarn, who's a co-creator of this. When it comes to duration, Culture Capital can be as short as 15 minutes. It can be as long as 3 hours for a match. And so when you come and you are watching this thing, you're not necessarily sure how long this game is going to take, but that's consistent with a lot of different kinds of games. As for silence, often we are told in the theater to be a relatively silent audience. And it is quite heartening to see that even in the live online version of it, that the chat is actually quite active and people are rooting for who they're rooting for. And the affordance of that means that we can have interregional players more easily with the different regional context decks. So this is the deck from Alberta, which includes Edmonton and Calgary, but we also have 4 decks. So we have 4 decks for Alberta, 4 decks for BC, Ontario, Quebec, and later on this year, we'll be adding Atlantic Canada, starting the territories and the prairies as well. So hopefully by the end of this year, we'll have mapped most regions across Canada. That being said, if you want to be part of these discussions, if you want to play with us, and if you're from any of the new regions that we're going to, Atlantic Canada, the territories, or the prairies, please get in touch. I'll put my contact information in the chat later. And when it comes to variability, and coming back again to that liveness and the risk, one of the ways that we do that is that similar to any other kind of game, one has to bring the story out of the gameplay itself. And so similar to my Fallout story with the haircuts, I might not tell, say, 2 players to discuss how arts funding gets distributed differently in Alberta versus BC. But for example, in one of our online games, a friend of mine, Mark Hopkins, was talking about the funding that comes from casinos in a card called Casino Cash. And he used that as a launching off point to discuss how much money in Alberta artists get by hosting as not-for-profits different casino nights from those funding bodies. And in BC, we have a parallel, which is BC Gaming Funds, that doesn't require artists to go in and staff these casino nights, but it is money that comes from casinos ostensibly. So that kind of conversation was not necessarily built into the game, but it comes out of some cards that we made based on those conversations. a place in which risk is heavily involved is a card called Decolonial Practices, which also has a parallel in community engagement. So the way that that card works is that when it's played, your opponent then has to go through and look at each of their projects and say why they're committed to decolonial practices. And every time they fail to impress their judge, which is the player of the card, they lose a grant on that. And so often you are looking at, say, this card right here, Ginger Beef. It's a truly Chinese Canadian heritage dance piece about how the famous Chinese Canadian dish was invented in Calgary. Trying to spin that into how it's related to decolonial practices is not unlike what a lot of people are doing on grants and in art creation these days, but it's also very much heightened when you're put in front of a live audience, and very suspect to the kind of words that you're saying and the languages that we use to validate our approaches to this. And it's less so mean spirited, and it's more about like, how do we honestly talk about these things? That's not hidden away behind a quiet room where a jury is assessing something, and we don't really get to hear the feedback one to one. Yeah, so we have different versions of this. Hopefully later this year, we'll have more online games of it, which are more to do with, let me just go to that page, CC Online. So these are games where we invite different players from different regions with their regional decks to come and play for $500 of Canadian public arts money. And yeah, the game generally looks like a tabletop game that's played online. I'm just going to skip ahead to this format, which is kind of inset screens. You're looking at the score. I'm triggering things live based on their actions when they pick up cards, when they receive money. And so also what's in the chat. When certain things are played in the chat, or mentioned in the chat, will often bring them into the game in some way, whether or not it's like I'm rooting for Jenna or I'm rooting for Maddie, or that was a bad play. That kind of critique actually does make a difference on the gameplay as the players are going. The next example that I wanted to bring up is called Asses.masses. So this again is made with my friend Patrick Blencarn. This is the game about donkeys, and we in art speak very cheekily say that it's a solo performance for multiple players about sharing the load revolution, and it's also an arcade installation that we're making. So we're currently building this, rebuilding this right now. We imagine that it's going to be about like 5 or 6 different episodes long. It could be 5 or 6 hours long as a performance. But generally what it looks like is that every night an audience member steps forward from the herd or from the group to seize the means of production, which in this case would be a video game controller, to lead us through a world of asses or donkeys in pursuit of a just life. And we follow the narratives of multiple asses as they contemplate labor politics, they protest against their human oppressors, and generally speaking, it's about obsolescence of the manual laborer, political idealism, digital labor, and virtual revolution. And this is, I think, a critical moment to be looking at these things because of the changing relationship to labor and performance, the politics of the body on stage. So this is not a performance that is happening digitally. This is a performance that happens in a live theater, and that is conceptually important because of the way that we relate to the theatrical rituals. Patrick brought into the project that Thespis, arising from the Greek chorus to become the first actor, is very similar to how in kind of couch co-op, or not even couch co-op, but playing in the basement with your friends some video games, the person that elects themselves to be the leader of that situation, I'm going to play this section of Legend of Zelda, and I'm going to lead us through this dungeon, and we might backseat drive that situation of like, oh, you should have picked up that bomb and thrown it at the wall. That would have been faster, or shot that arrow. There are ways that spectatorship in our generation has kind of culminated in a different way of approaching time and how we approach participation. And let's see if I can actually bring that up right here. Oh, so so I don't know if anyone's actually active in the chat, but running the game right here, Which does your society value more? Those who stay with the herd or those who step away from the herd? Oh, I loaded it twice. That's why. Hold on. Let me see if I can. Okay. Do you think of yourself as a political animal? Okay. Oh, I see. So there's some delay. So this might not be the best example of it. Andrew, actually, could I get a quick time check on how much more time that I have? Just because I don't want to spend too much time on this if I'm running out. 30 minutes. Great. Okay. I'll spend a little bit of time on this. So maybe instead of getting feedback from the comments, I'll just play through a little bit of this. I did accidentally load the I gotta know from the tech. Anyway, avatar required. No from the chat. I see. Okay. No. Thank you. I meant to hit no. I'm sorry. I pressed yes. But anyway, so let's say we are. Do you think of yourself as an intelligent animal? I'm going to say yes. I might get judgment from whoever else is in the audience when I play this. Do I have urges to copulate and reproduce? Yeah. My natural habitat, let's go with concrete jungle. And which of these mythic and literary heroes do I identify with the most? Let's go with Midas. Okay. Do I have experience doing manual labor every day? I did work as a construction worker for 1 day. Have I ever gone on labor strike due to unfair or dangerous working conditions? I have, but not for my own labor. Back in grade 10, I went on strike as a student, waving my I love math sign. Would you consider yourself to be the best representative of my species to lead a revolution? I think I could be an effective leader. So there's a bit of layering because I accidentally triggered the wrong button, but I won't go back for the sake of time. So this section is about the intelligence of, or rather, the extent to which I have knowledge about donkeys as the ideal and literary religious symbol for labor. So I know this one, but you ass means equus asinus. I'd hit that ass means that they would have sexual intercourse with another human if they could. Yes. So at this point, if I don't know the answer, I can actually appeal to the rest of the audience, as I could appeal to my friends who are also playing the game with me for what the answer is. So I know that in the Old Testament, a human named Balaam is hitting his ass when all of a sudden God gives the ass the ability to speak. In Aesop's fables, I won't spend too long on this, but the disenfranchised are forced to imitate those in power without ever attaining more power is wrong, because I didn't read that question all the way through. In ancient Greece, asses are symbolized for fertility because male asses have very large penises. Oldest surviving work of graffiti from ancient Rome depicts Jesus with an ass's head. Yafur committed suicide by throwing itself down a well. Philosophical proposition, bird in the ass. Placed between a bucket of water and a bale of hay, they will always choose indecision. Okay. So going through this thing, there are, and you can actually hear it, but there's correct sounds or incorrect sounds based on what you say. I don't know all these answers, so I might put the wrong thing. Right. So then we'd be able to play the rest of the game through, and as it goes through different game formats. So importantly in this section, I want to bring up the thing that came up several years ago, which is Twitch plays Pokemon. And that's an important distinction, because if you're not familiar with it, this is where someone outfitted the chat comment function of Twitch to be able to control a Pokemon video game emulator. And so throughout, I can't remember how long it was, but several days, maybe a week, people were playing Pokemon, the Game Boy version, selecting up, down, left, right, select, start, A and B, and trying to navigate through this game. And it was a huge amount of people who are coming together to try and do it. And it was very hectic. It was a little bit crazy, but it was also a way that we can see how how have collaboratively played video games kind of come into importance? And if I was to draw a parallel with the kind of adages that I've heard of theater, I think I can't remember for the life of me who said it, but I wrote down last night that theater is a place to practice conflict. And I believe that. But formally, if I was to agree with this, I would say most theater that I've seen has taught me how to be a bystander in conflict. And in this, we're asking for people to take control of this, and they can self-elect to, like, I don't want to play this section anymore. So they might walk away. Someone else has to come up and lead the herd. And so at this section, we are running around and we're collecting all of our comrades, necessarily socialist in form, just trying to get all these asses so that we can lead a charge onto the humans. Now, this is the old version. We have a new version that is in the works, and at the end of this month, we'll be showing. Unfortunately, it will be in a live performance, safely distanced situation, so it won't be online, so not everyone can see it. But we'll definitely put this out there into different festivals as much as we can when it's safer to organize back in person. So yeah, we're also very heavily invested in the ideas of revolution, of activism, of revolt, security systems, and forms of lateral leadership. And I think that these are conversation that's happening very much in the performance ecosystem as well, as we consider what are the visible roles of power and of leadership, and how can we better take responsibility for this moment in time as leaders, as participants, as activists. These video games do, I think, teach us in many ways and model for us particular ways of inhabiting space and working together. So importantly, live performance already includes a lot of games. There are lots of games in performance structures that we see, game creation especially, or a devised performance. But largely, there's an exclusion of game culture as performance. And I think that hopefully we are trying to come against that to say, like, well, games are a kind of performance under a specific lens that we might look at it with. So I could go through this. It goes through lots of forms. Like, it goes into a 3D world. It goes into a rhythm game where you have sex between two donkeys. And it sounds very zany, but it's all grounded in this narrative that is very sprawling and, again, changes over the course of 6 hours. At the moment, we only have the first hour and a half, but we're constantly building this thing in Unity, and we're learning how to build these things as we go because we are not trained game designers, but we're trying. So I'm going to close this for now. And I'm going to also go over to my third example or case study that I'd like to bring, which is gather.town. I do work with the digital storytelling team at the Cultch, and this is one of the things that we're working on, which is, if you're not familiar with GatherTown, it's a spatialized teleconferencing platform with a 2D avatar, as you see right here, and customizable settings of backgrounds. So the idea here is that you could very easily just use it as a Zoom replacement, but because it has spatialized conversations going in. So if this was a real person, it's just an avatar I put in there. But a real person, their camera would pop up, their microphone would turn on as well. And if I'm close enough to this person, if I stick close to them, we can continue a conversation. It's very exciting to see people run into this for the first time, because oftentimes you'll see people running around and exploring space. You'll see incidental run-ins with other people that you don't usually get these days because of COVID. But that's a very exciting place because it replicates in some ways the format of what we're used to in lobby areas and those transitory spaces. So I did propose this idea where we can use Gather as a virtual venue, and we built the version of the Cultch so that it can be a somewhat of a vessel or container for other digital performances. At the moment, we've only used it for talkbacks. We've used it for ancillary events or added kind of extra show transmedia storytelling elements. But this is an extension of that, in which very much from theme parks and thinking about the hub and spoke model of there's a hub and you can see all the different attractions whichever direction you look. we're looking at the prospect of building a hub that unites different virtual venues to create a virtual kind of centralization of different digital performances. And this really comes out of thinking how many times there is digital programming going on, especially right now. But because of the ways that social media and algorithmic culture works, in that we're siloed in our communities or people that we're friends with, very generally speaking, we don't often get to know about all the different kinds of performance that's happening in different venues from place to place to place. So I propose that we build, this is the hub space that I've built so far. And here would be the information desk where you could find out very quickly like what's going on in these 4 different venues. So far, we have confirmed 2 of the venues, and we have 2 more that we're in discussions with. And then over here at the top, you would get to choose like, oh, great, I'm going to go to the Cultch, which I haven't connected the portals just yet. I'm going to go to Prairie Theater Exchange in Winnipeg, or I'm going to go to any of the other 2 venues. You might run into other people. They will likely be in different time zones. And hopefully modeled after the theater center's social space in Toronto, I wanted to have a place where you can sit down in these private chairs. And when you sit down in a chair, you can only hear and talk to the other people who are in other tiles that I've assigned to that. So this is ostensibly around the same table. So hopefully when you come into the space, you can see that it might be relatively active. People can have their meetings totally unrelated to the venues themselves. And this, for me, calls into a question about the persistence of space and the persistence of different home kind of areas, home areas. So thinking about that venues and galleries have often worked by pulling people to places, and the way that especially a lot of algorithmic culture teaches us these days, which is to push outwards, to meet halfway. And I think that that's an important lesson for how we as digital creators can also be considering how work is also created, that it's about meeting a halfway. And I think that a lot of digital performance that I'm seeing is kind of constructing everything and inviting people in at the last minute. And there's a real kind of opportunity here to consider, well, what happens when we create a structure and we allow people to play within it. And so very much on that model, this space exists when I'm not here. So people can come in and have their meetings, and it doesn't necessarily have to be about me sitting here waiting for you and holding your hand throughout a performance. But once we hook up the outdoor space, you could take your friend out for a walk. You can discover things every Sunday, or however we define the timing. We could also repopulate the space so that one time when you walk out or go into a theater space, it might be just a black box theater, and another time it might be this amazing pirate ship that I haven't made yet, but I want to. So highly mutable, persistent spaces. I think as an extension of kind of venues could be a very exciting premise. So this is something that we're working on. And I've been seeing a more and more kind of gather.town prototypes of different performances coming up. And this is not the only platform that can do something like this, but I bring it up as an example because I think the simplicity by which you can access it is also a huge reason of transitioning different logics of how we assemble as a community. There are lots of people in our community that don't know how to install certain programs, allow access to microphones and cameras, but this is all browser based. So it's really just a link that you send out and people click on it and then they join, they press OK. And I think it's a 2-button operation, which is pretty astounding. It also generates an avatar for you that is a mix of different gender, sex, different able-bodied, disabled bodies. Yeah, so they're currently working on it more and more. But generally speaking, the ease of which someone can come into this platform, I think, is pretty important. Thinking about how Zoom was popularized so quickly during the pandemic because of the ease in which it was to send a link to someone versus having to add them as contact and everything else, which was probably like a 7-click operation. So those are the 3 different case study things that I wanted to bring up. And Pat, I'm okay to stop screen sharing if that's okay with you. And I'd like to end this section off with 3 provocations or 3 things on my mind. Jesse Schell, the game designer in 2013, has a talk called The Future of Storytelling and How Medium Shapes Stories. If you want to, you should totally watch it. It's an amazing, amazing talk that feels quite prophetic. So he asks, is it possible for video games to have truly amazing stories? And so he looks at the development of Dungeons and Dragons and what came before it. He looks at Chris Swain's proposition that films are the literature of the 20th century, but they weren't taken seriously until there was sound. And the proposal there is that games need to learn how to listen, and then they will be the art of the 21st century. And so that brings into question for me, what are our best narratives? And specifically, where do those narratives take place? So Jesse Schell in his discussion brings up that we can have different kinds of narratives based on where we are accessing different people. So there's the nook, or the kind of sitting area. There's the workplace, which is the table. There's the living room. And then there's on the go in the kitchen, kind of on your phone. And he was saying that the kind of stories that he's interested in, the ones that are often long form, the ones that engage us in longer formats, are often in the workplace or the nook, because other places are geared towards other kind of platforms. But the nook is often like where you read. And so tablets are often that place where those things happen. And then the workplace is often a laptop, or oftentimes a desktop, a PC. And that's where you're kind of, at least for me, I'm spending about like 14, 16 hours a day at this place. And those kind of questions come into play because as we consider digital performance and what that looks like, there are different affordances on what we ask of where our audience takes place. So the specificity of tuning in from a specific location, like I want you to tune in from a bathroom, and then other situations like tune in from outside in a socially distanced area, tune in from underneath a desk, you name it. But each of those has different proposals and different kind of modes of storytelling that we can gain from that. The second provocation is about acceleration. It's hard to talk about digital without talking about it, because technology has moved so fast, more fast than any other generation that has come before us. And because of that, I believe that there's more of a collapse of time than we've ever seen. Often the transition from one format into another, even from like CD to DVD to Blu-ray, is something that you see over generations. We've seen that all within my generation, which is a lot. And that suggests to me that in the collapse of time, there are ramifications for synchronous and asynchronous performance, in considering that what has been said is in dialogue with what is being said. And even thinking about different, problematic things that have come up, like Trudeau's brownface incident, that like those things are more tethered in time than ever before. And so considering this this synchronous or asynchronous performance, and thinking about, again, liveness and about gathering, or at what point is it live? Is it live when I'm watching a piece of archival? And I remember from the talk yesterday, I can't remember who there was a kind of warm and cheeky comment about like no one wants to watch archival performance, which generally speaking is absolutely true. I'll say one of the initiatives that I'm working on is called VideoCan, and it's an online archive of Canadian performance video documentation. And it's geared towards increasing art literacy through a shared learning and learning platform, forging a new relationship to video material. And I know that comment was largely about like single frame or single camera operations. And I think that there's just a lot to learn from media of the past as we move forward. So thinking again about this provocation being grounded on what is the now, and what does it relate to in the recent past. And lastly, just to wrap everything in the container of the title of this presentation, digital placemaking, I believe that we need to loosen our definitions and invite new vocabularies of digital performance. So if theater is to develop, and if it is to have a place in the social fabric of our time, it's not in the new it's not in the new venues that we have to create. It's in the new frameworks of how we spend our time and the value that we place on it. And so I hope that in the future I'll see more untethering from the traditions of live performance, of something that needs to be a certain length or a certain duration over certain narrative construction, and really going into places and asking more of us as participants and as co-creators of this new way of thinking about digital performance, which has been growing. There are people that have been working on it for a long, long time, but I think now there's more of a push behind it, and I'm very excited to see where it goes. So with those are my three provocations. Thank you very much for allowing me to share. I'd love to invite Andrew back for some Q&A.
Hey, that's really great. Thank you for sharing all your ideas. There's a lot to unpack in there, and I think that you're asking a lot of really big questions, and probably some of the more interesting kind of unique usage of performance that I've seen recently. So I'm very curious to see where asses.masses goes, and culturecapital. They're both very, very interesting projects. So I'm very curious, maybe just to discuss more about like what brought you originally. What was it? Was there a turning point that really like fired you off to start into this down this kind of path?
Yeah, I guess it depends on which path in particular. Digital more generally, or games?
I think games. Yeah.
Games. Yeah, absolutely. I think actually to go back on that, it's a little bit of both. There was working with my company Hong Kong Exile. The three of us, Natalie Tinyan Gan, who comes from a dance background, and Remy Su, who comes from a new music and composition background. The three of us kind of sat together and we were thinking a lot about how do we articulate the gestures or expressions of our time without essentializing our Chineseness. Because like one could say like, oh yes, we could just have an erhu on stage, we could have traditional Chinese dance forms, but that doesn't seem true to who we are and how we've grown up as Chinese diaspora. And so out of that, I think Remy and I in particular started to look back to video games as the kind of ways that we know frameworks of storytelling, the ways that we understand participation and creation, and things really that inspired us as we grew up. So thinking about those things, I think probably about like 7-8 years ago, both of us started on somewhat different paths, but thinking about games and how we want to use them as performance structures, and reconsidering like all those things that we thought for a long time were ancillary or outside of our art are actually maybe more central to how we want to relate to art and creation these days. So more specifically, I'll say, I think in Foreign Radical with Theater Conspiracy, we started thinking about participation in games around security and surveillance and how much information we're giving away. And out of that, we decided to make it a game, which is throughout the performance, you realize is not quite a game, but something that you're necessarily implicit in that seems like a game, but is actually just using you. And those are, I think, when the conversation started arising around, well, what are games allowing us to do in the here and now? And we all understand certain frameworks of games, and that can be used as a game or something else in an artistic manner. And I think that's the particular piece where I started thinking about it.
Great. And so how do you stretch yourself as a creator in order to start changing the way that you are thinking about creation? Because you were mentioning how we want to loosen our definitions of digital performance and performance in general. How do you start to put your brain into that kind of context of looking away from traditional media forms?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think on my end, there's first an acknowledgement of what the current forms that we attune to, what they afford us. And so coming back to some of the things that I brought up in my presentation, there are certain narratives that work better in these kind of hour-long formats compared to other things, like a character sitting there for like 10 minutes just sitting out and looking at the ocean maybe works better in a 2-hour format because of the patience that as spectators we allow ourselves to sit with things. And I remember on a piece that I made with a friend of mine, David Yee at Fujian Theater, we would often be at odds or fighting about like this moment should it be longer or shorter. And within a certain theatrical tradition, I think that it would want to be shorter to get the air out of it, to get more content to the person, to not leave anyone bored. But from my perspective, I would often say that I'm more interested in someone becoming bored, in allowing their mind to wander into their own subjectivity, and out of that space, that when they come back into this meditative space of considering what these malls, these social spaces are like in the show, that they bring their own kind of histories with it. So there are different kind of ways that functions, but I think attuning to what the current form allows you to do allows you to then break from it or play around it.
And so I guess just leading more into a purely technical question, because it's something that like a lot of people watching this who aren't creating these kind of performances that are games driven might be asking is, how do you, what suggestions, because you're not a game, you mentioned that you're not a trained game builder, that this is just something that you've developed over time with an interest in video games. What would you suggest is a good starting path if somebody thinks they want to start to divert from their current traditional forms? What have you learned along the way that's kind of that you want to pass on to other creators?
Yeah, great question again. I think certainly there are so many tutorials online, but chasing if I've learned anything from other game creators, it's to start with a project that you really want to make, and do things in small sections, because a lot of first time game creators will try and make something relatively large or grand, and the questions that they have there are amazing, but how to get from step A to point A to point B is actually a huge leap. And I think building in small parts, or building little prototypes of how does this mechanic function, is much more fruitful than trying to work for 3 years on something from scratch. So I think that's a relatively pragmatic response, but I do think that small and incremental steps will help you see and benchmark where you're at and what you can actually achieve, and change and pivot in that moment.
We got a really good question from the audience here. So you brought up emergent storytelling, Ari, your haircut and the games that you were playing. Can you speak a bit more about your practice interests with emergent storytelling in your work? How do you make space for emergence?
Yeah. Often there's just like removing information. If anyone's played the video game Kentucky Route Zero, there are amazing conversations from the game creators themselves. It's a magical realist kind of story about this route that you have to take. I don't want to ruin anything, so it's told through a variety of different formats. It's stylistically and formally just super impressive, and it's a game that's clearly created by very critically thinking artists. They draw from a lot of cinema and theater. They often talk about designing mystery. And in doing so, it's not about providing all the answers, but asking lots of different questions. And so when I consider how I'm making space for emergence, I think that often it starts with like, what is the question that's being asked of us? And then as participants, how can we make it more interesting or challenging for them to do, to construct whatever that answer is, or the next question if we're asking them to come up with another question. And that can look like a lot of different things. But a lot of game designers will just be asking, okay, so here's the kind of set structure of, in, for example, decolonial practices in Culture Capital. How can we make it more intense? Well, one, you put it in front of a live audience. You can also adjust the time scale so that you only maybe have 30 seconds to answer or a minute. And so as we consider those things, those will draw out different kinds of emergent storytelling. But generally speaking, to weave in a sort of relationship to the material, I think most of us will often have our own kind of preferences and aesthetic ideas. Even avatar building, like most people have a certain preference for how they prefer their avatars to look. So I think that it's already kind of there. We just need to leave room for it. I know that's maybe too much of a cryptic answer, but yeah, I don't know. I'll leave it with that.
That's a great answer. Because I was just thinking that too, like how much time I spend, because I play a lot of video games too, and how much time I spend choosing the costume of the character to reference like the animal that you're riding, like the your saddle and that just in whatever moment it is that you're playing. It's really interesting to try to bring that back to like a live performance aspect. I did have a question about the decolonial practices question. When you're putting somebody on, like, do you ever have an instance of complete freezing in these performances? And is there ever a reaction that you are absolutely not expecting and could be deemed pretty destructive? Does that kind of thing happen?
No, we haven't had a moment that feels destructive. I personally have frozen because I've had that card played against me, and I've done both extremely well in front of audiences, but also extremely poorly, in which like I was bringing up things that are not about the project, but someone who is attached to the company, and I was like, oh, like they have a certain practice, which is a kind of shirking of the responsibility of that kind of question, but. The game allows us a certain level of play, of levity around this thing, which is why we have real information, real companies. These are our friends, our colleagues, our peers who are creating work. And we are putting the public information that is already out in the public, but putting it more central into a game in conversation with other companies. These things can be seen as like a little bit cheeky or subversive, but at no point do we think that it's trying to be unkind to anyone. Mostly because the game allows us to raise up a certain level of fiction, so that there might be my company Hong Kong Exile doing a documentary theater piece, which we normally wouldn't do, but say in this game we did, and in that space of fictional tension of with what can or can't be done, or what would or would not be actually manifest in the world, I think that we can actually have a space for ourselves as spectators to not look at everything as one-to-one realistic according to the people, but maybe according to the sector. So hopefully it's less about blaming a certain person. In that moment, the audience is not booing you, but more or less your ideas are the things that came up, which are hopefully emblematic of the ways in which we talk about those things. So, I mean, really, the whole card game comes out of a desire to break free from panel discussions as the only way that we talk about things, because I personally don't find panel discussions are the most helpful conversation containers.
How do you feel about like the aspects of round tables where you've got many people that can join into the conversation? Is that the same feeling?
I think all these things require a really good moderator, and I don't know if I've seen a lot of great moderation in it writ large, not just in relationship to any particular kind of. Not talking about the symposium. I'm being very clear.
But it's kind of a pointed question.
Yeah. No, but good moderation goes a long way. And I think the kind of questions that we talk about, generally speaking, I'll say that I always desire for panel discussions and roundtables to be about not regurgitation of information individuals already know, but a meeting place of those different conversations, where we will formulate new frameworks together versus something that I could watch on someone's like YouTube channel or TED Talk from 10 years ago. And I think that's where a good moderation can get there. But if not, then sometimes you're just getting the same things that someone has said over and over again.
So in the terms of culture capital, there is no moderation other than the game itself and what people are playing against each other. So in that way, is the conversations being controlled by the players, forcing it upon each other?
The conversations are really guided by the players. We might, as moderators, bring certain things out at certain points, especially Patrick. I'm often running all the tech behind the scenes, but he will often say like, great, okay, so you're going to play that card. It's not often it's on the cusp of moderation, in which we might pry or try to get an anecdote out. Oftentimes it's really like, that's happening. Okay, well, great. And sending the momentum over rather than controlling the discussion.
Yeah. Moving on to the your gather.town hub, what have you seen in terms of the groups that came into it? Because I believe you mentioned during our first chat way back when, like 2 months ago, you mentioned that there was a There was a Q&A session that kind of went off the rails. Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was 84 people that came, and a lot of people who didn't know how to use computers. And my heart goes out to them, but it was probably about like 10 minutes of nonstop, like, oh, can they hear me? And we eventually figured it out by having everyone go in there. But again, going back to the theatrical form, most people sat in the theater seats of the virtual venue facing the proscenium. And it was fantastic to see the ways in which we're so cultured around that. But also, I was like, oh, you could be walking anywhere. And I would say maybe about 3 or 5 out of the people were wandering around as I was talking, because I was kind of spotlit. You could be anywhere and seeing all these different things. But generally, the theatrical tradition still held. And we can use that as a framework, and then use that as a framework to deviate from later on.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So what do you think about in terms of using this kind of platform for actual performance, more so than just as a meeting place for conversation?
I've
Thoughts on that?
seen, yeah, I've seen Dragon Productions out of the States has done a couple shows. And for instance, one of the shows that I saw had 4 different levels of engagement, which I thought was a smart idea. One, you could just go to the back of the room and watch in your private space on the Jumbotron that someone had brought Gather into its own kind of website wrapper. So you were able to play Gather from inside of a website interface, and they actually built an inventory system where you could pick things out of, say, a cabinet and put it in your backpack and trade it with other people, which was actually quite exciting. And so that's one level of engagement. You can just not talk to anyone else, and you can just watch the live stream circus performance in the background. Another mode of engagement would be to walk up to these digital non-playable characters, and each of them is a link, because you can have interactable objects in Gather, a link to a YouTube channel, or a YouTube video, sorry, where you can select in a narrative branching tree different directions of the conversation, and it's a live performer who has recorded themselves and is saying, like, what do you think? And it says yes or no, and you choose, and it goes down that branch. The third level of engagement is where there's a kind of one-on-one performance. So similar to Sleep No More, you might find someone, they say like, hey, come with me, and you can tell that they're a performer, so you go with them and they'll do a one-on-one performance with you for a little bit. And then 4, which is there's a macro kind of roaming promenade style structure where a performance is happening, you join in for it, and they say, great, let's all portal over to this room. And so all 4 of those engagements are simultaneous and going on at the same time, and it was framed around a party. So temporally, it also made sense that it only happens for this moment in time, for this night. So you need to kind of go around, and as you would like a real party, go into whatever conversation you want. And there were times where I checked in and checked out, but that was a very kind of exciting proposal of a different style of performance in which I could be on my own time, seeing what I wanted. I could have went and used washroom or made a sandwich and come back and then continued something. Yeah.
That sounds really interesting. So when you're saying the live stream circus performance, was that separate? That was actual real people in a box that you could watch on a screen inside of your game?
Yes. So whether or not it was live, who knows? But it was inset into the website on the top right-hand corner, and it was the thing that was consistently playing music. And then on 10-15 minute intervals, then you would get someone coming on the screen and saying like, okay, everybody, we're at the party. And then the screen would go full screen, and that's where you could get some of the content relayed throughout all the different participants. But generally, you could just watch the circus alone, or you could just have it as background as you go and do other things. Yeah.
Okay.
Lots of questions.
Super cool. Actually, I wanted to ask this other one while we were talking about Gather.town, but how secure is Gather.town with webcam access? Does it manage to avoid hackers?
I'm not experienced enough in the world of hackery that I could say for sure what happens, but we haven't had any problems thus far. I'm sure that based on how small the team is behind Gather, that it's probably not as secure as other large platforms. But we haven't had kind of Zoom bombings or anything like that just yet. As for other kind of high-level hackers that will get into your information and use things, no precedents of it that I've seen, but that also is not a secured answer. So unfortunately, that's all I can share with you at the moment.
Okay. So then the other question from the comments, what's your relationship to care and games, or care and digital art making? How do you care for your audiences in these mediums? Is that necessary?
I think a certain level of thought around care is absolutely necessary to make distinct, I guess, what kind of care we're talking about, because care can manifest in so many different ways. If you mean a general uh, verbal consent to what is being done, that is one level of care. But I think often in my work, I look at um, when someone self-elects as they're kind of consenting to a certain experience. So if they self-elect from the audience to stand up and lead everyone in this thing, um, that is hopefully implied consent and care around um, like the moment in which they come to something. And we think a lot about those moments of when you purchase a deck of cards for Culture Capital. We're not in control of any of those things, but there's always a website and an email that you can find us at if you have more information about the cards. But generally speaking, as well, I don't feel like we're putting people into very precarious situations. Um, so it's a little bit hard because it is so varied. So someone could be playing just in a coffee shop. Someone else can be playing online. Someone could be playing cards, like on the side of a busy bridge. To a certain extent, we can't maintain control over it because we've released ourselves from having to be present when the piece is active. So we think about it a lot, but there is a certain amount of release that we've had to afford ourselves by virtue of, like, Magic the Gathering can't can't care for everyone when they're not there. They can only care for them by providing more tutorials, more comprehensive information, pushing information out to whoever buys their things. And I think that's the extent to which we're also thinking about it at the moment.
Do you find that the audience in these games, when there's a request from the participants for help with one particular answer, do you find that they're generally on the more supportive side of things?
The audience?
Yeah.
Yeah, we've seen people who just picked up the game, like Culture Capital, try and teach someone else. Sometimes they'll teach it wrong, which is completely fine. Like, you don't have to play. I've played Pokemon wrong for most of my life, and I learned that relatively recently. But Pokemon, the card game,
Mhm.
and yeah, people generally kind of like, oh, well, that's a great question. And if they don't know, we do have a comprehensive guidebook as well as video tutorials that show almost everything you need to know. Um, so yeah, generally speaking, people do try and teach each other. We've had players even discuss the game to each other using ASL because they're just playing the game. And yeah, the kind of community gathering space, coming back to one of those main things I brought up at the beginning of the talk, it does feel very much like a kind of a, a space where we have to take responsibility for each other in learning this game together. And I think that that's an important place that we have. We often have at least a table or two set aside at our live tournaments where people will teach each other, and we will be there just in case. But it's really heartening to see people kind of work the logics in their own way and try to describe the game and in their own languages.
Is there a difference in the way that the players play from your your staged versions, not stage versions, but your versions that are played on in front of an audience versus the tournament setting where there isn't an audience? Is there an audience?
Totally. We on two ways. One, we can't see the cards as easily when we're playing online. So oftentimes, Patrick, as the moderator, will be able to say, like, "Great, well, this is happening over here. How do you respond to this?" Often we have to listen much more attentively to things, and even ask sometimes, like, "What card did you just play?" And that's okay. I think there's a kind of narrative sense making that's happening. And for that reason, we do ask our players to be much more detailed and explicit in their descriptions of what's happening as they go along, compared to when they're playing in live performance, in which we can support them with that. So, for example, I might say, like, I'm going to play this strategy called Thinking Small. To cut your costs, you relocated your show into an elevator. It's only up from here, and that's a +6. And we'll ask them to hold the card up to the camera, just again so that we can have those senses of what's happening and what's being played. And then we do also ask the players to really think about the emergent storytelling and the ways in which things are connected. So, for example, I might say like there's an all-female cast that we're working with, and then someone might say, "Oh yes, and this is a show that is done by I don't know, like the all-male cast, so now it gets minus points." And so then there's a certain logic with like what happened to that show? Did it get recast, or uh, did the last cast I guess leave from the contract and then someone else came on? There's lots of different ways that that can be filled out, and we've been very pleased to see that as someone's playing, they're able to make sense out of those moments of incongruencies and also opportunities.
Asses.masses. Have you done a live version of it yet, or that's still something you're working towards?
Yeah, we've done live versions of the old episodes 1 and 2. We have new episodes 1 and 2 that are coming out later this month, but the old versions have been performed in Singapore. There's one show that was done in Berlin, and then in Banff, Vancouver, Calgary. Yeah, we've done it a few different places, and every time the audience is so different.
Hmm.
Yeah.
In what ways?
Sometimes it's a very quiet audience. Like we did it in Kelowna in BC, which I assume because I've done shows in say Victoria, BC, and the response to those shows has been well. It was a projection piece where words were flashing really hard. It was a structural film piece that was set inside of a theater format, and if I was to do that in like Tokyo, it would be completely fine. But doing it in Victoria, where the rate of media is so much slower in some ways, the audience actually revolted and they said, "Stop the show! This is too fast," which was incredible. And half the audience walked out like screaming at me, saying like, "This is too fast! This is too much!" But then the other half of the audience, they were totally locked in, and to generally say, a lot of them were younger. So. Yeah, the audiences for asses.masses are vastly different insofar as some are more collaborative. Some of them have really been yelling at each other, like, "Oh, go left, go right. What are you doing?" Like, "Oh, don't you remember that moment?" Other times, people switch off really quickly, and that's not something that we script for anyone. It's truly just a video game controller on a stage, and then the audience has to figure out what to do with it. Yeah, and sometimes sometimes really surprising things happen. Like one person just pressed X and forwarded through a lot of dialogue, and everyone's like, "Why would you do that? I couldn't read anything." Yeah, it changes a lot depending on who's performing.
Mm-hmm. And so, do you have a in the same way with Culture Capital? Do you have a presenter? Like, is Patrick up there leading the game, or it's literally people walk in, here's a controller, figure it out?
For Culture Capital?
Sorry, no, for asses.masses.
For asses.masses. Yeah, we never unveil ourselves as the artists, or we try not to. There was one instance in which we were being presented and we were brought on stage for something, but largely speaking, it is ideally not even a front of house speech, but controller, spotlight, and then the lights are out, and we wait until someone presses on the controller or picks it up, and then we hit go on the show. In this next iteration, we're not even going to be there in person, so we have to depend on someone else to do it for us, which is really just one button, go, and then leave it. Sometimes we've been in situations where Patrick and I, because no one knows that we're creators, we're also in the back heckling people. Sometimes to dissuade them from going certain places, or sometimes just for fun. But yeah, we very much have our hands off as soon as the show starts.
And what's the usual amount of time before somebody figures it out?
Pretty fast. I mean, they're guided by the light and nothing else to do, really. So it's really a question of courage at that point of like, who's going to go up and do it? Am I going to self-elect? Am I going to know what to do once I get there? I think on one of the first showings, someone rushed up and grabbed the controller and stood there for about 5 seconds in silence and then turned around and said, "What do I do?" And everyone said, "Press X." Yeah.
That's great. So just on video games, what are your inspirations? Like what games have you played that have really built themselves into your theater practice?
Great question. Kentucky Road Zero I mentioned already by Cardboard Computers. Most recently, I mean, these are somewhat AAA games, but Death Stranding. I thought Hideo Kojima's thoughts behind Strand games, as he's popularizing it as, or calling it, in which it's about the community, it's about people. The Japanese proverb, I think, where the stick becomes the rope, so where the weapon becomes a tether to others. Um, Reconsidering those in light of the game industry as it is currently, I think is an exciting proposal and an exciting offering to everyone else. The Last of Us Part 2, I know that it was quite divisive in how it treated its characters, but I do think that it was asking a lot of us and repositioning, I think, the authors in a very exciting way to say, like, no, this is my script. You don't have control. It's not a free world. It's not open sandbox in this game. Um, in terms of indie developers, I can't remember his name right now, but 1 Hour, One Life is an amazing game in which you have 1 hour from when you start, and you either start as an Eve or you start as a baby. And if you start as a baby, your language is only capped at one letter that you can communicate with for the first, I think, 5-10 minutes of your time in the world. And then you have to be carried around by other people in order to live. If you don't, then as a baby, you can die within like 5 minutes. But each of the minutes is an hour of someone's life in game, and you are rushing around as a community of strangers trying to care for each other and then trying to make anything. And it's really hard to make things to try and, like, you have to run all the way here, grab some water in this generative map. And then you have to create a little, you create clothing for yourself to keep warm. You have to keep feeding yourself every like minute or two. So it's really people running around. But I've had some profound moments of someone who picked me up. He was an older man in the game, so probably playing for about like 45, 50 minutes, and said, do you know how to take care to berries and how to water these things and grow it for the community? I said, no. He says, I'll teach you. He carried me around, helped me pick all these berries, and I took those berries, and he's like, okay, great. So now you know how to do this. Do you know how to do that? And he showed me a couple things, and he said, great. Any other questions? I said, no. And he says, great, because I only have about like 2 minutes left. And he said, here, take these. Gave me his clothes. And then he walked to the center of town and started typing to everyone, like, goodbye, everyone. Thanks so much for the time together. I love you all. And everyone was just rushing by, doing their thing, saying, we love you too. Thanks so much for contributing so much. And then he turned into a pile of bones on his 60th minute. And there's this moment of like, okay, well, now I have his old clothes, I have his old job. Now I have to continue this thing. And very unfortunately, I failed really bad. so yeah, that's the thing.
Sorry, what you say? What was the name of that game? Because that's really beautiful. Sorry,
1 Hour, One Life.
1 Hour, One Life. That's really
yeah,
that's really beautiful, because it's like such a nice form of community that everyone has to work together, and then it's not about any one particular person winning over the others. It's a great combination. Yeah, I think we're getting close to our time. So if anyone has any other questions, please feel free to put those in the chat. Is there anything, Milton, that you would love to impart upon the world?
I already had my 3 provocations.
After that, we followed that
up. But yeah, I think we're at a very exciting kind of moment. I was thinking so much. I couldn't sleep last night because I was thinking more and more about these questions. I'll say, just as a response to all the discussions that have been happening for this symposium, that I've been very heartened to see how many people are thinking about these things, and especially because some of these platforms and ways in which we're working are shrouded in so much mystery. To be giving it a platform, I'm very, very thankful that that there's a community of people who are willing to share so openly. And in the spirit of things like VideoCAN, that video archive I was talking about, I've been coming more and more back to this idea of like build it and give it away for free as a kind of model. And I see it really in a lot of these design communities where, like, here, just take this as an example. I guess I'll plug a little bit of VideoCAN, because oftentimes in this work, we are funded by the Digital Strategy Fund to look at the contractual agreements that often govern the ways in which we make work, make artistic performance in this country. I mean, so much of ADC is predicated around that central premise as well. Like, how do we organize? How do we create these frameworks so that we can understand how we are valuing our time and our efforts and create safety for ourselves? But hopefully, in a lot of these languages, we leave the space for educational clauses that a lot of places around the world in our interviews are coming up and saying, like, we don't have that. We don't have any reason why education is forwarded in our contracts in any way. And I think that it's somewhat of a missed opportunity, because a lot of that is relegated to educational institutions, which have, by and large, been somewhat hard to access for a lot of things. And for some performance mediums, like playwriting, for example, it's really easy to, or it's not easy. There are frameworks that will allow people to share very openly already, so printing off scripts. But as someone who also directs once in a while, who designs, to try and find examples of people's work, especially full examples, so I can see it within the context of the entire show, it's really difficult sometimes. And I think for most of us, it's just sitting on a hard drive somewhere. And, like, we might be afraid to share it, but we have a clause, or we have a thing in our description for video cans saying, like, judge not by resolution. It's not about how good it looks. We don't think anyone's going to try and monetize your video, because, not to diss you, but it's not as good as you think it is to be monetized. Intellectual property, absolutely, we understand. But at the end of the day, I think that we'd be better off as a community if we just shared as openly as we could.
That's a lovely place to I think end off on, because I think that's definitely the mentality that's come behind the entirety of this symposium. That's why we're offering it for free, and why we brought on so many different creators who are willing to share themselves and share their abilities. They're failures too, right? That's like you said, it's not, we haven't all succeeded getting to this point. There's been like a lot of hurdles. So knowing where you've messed up is a really great place for the rest of us to avoid that if possible.
Yeah. And on that, I just want to say thank you again for your patience, as I, like, a lot of my plans for today's conversation, I had all my notes and everything, but the format I had all these crazy cool effects and everything, but at the end of things, it wasn't really necessary. But I appreciate the patience and the support by which ADC is approaching this with. Yourself, especially, Andrew, thank you for inviting me. And I'm very excited to see where the conversations continue to go.
Well, thank you again for being here, and for sharing. And yeah, it was great presentation. You have some great ideas, and I look forward to seeing where your work goes in the future. So
thank you.